Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is tuned in for today's seminar. Before I start, a really warm thanks to the collaborators, Global University for Sustainability, Lingnan University, the Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, and everyone else, especially the translators and organizers of this amazing series, and in particular to Sitsu Margaret Jade and to Professor Lau Kin Chi. Once again, this session we have two speakers, and I think it's going to be an extraordinarily interesting session. Our first speaker is Professor Issa Shivji. He is one of Africa's leading experts on law and development issues. He has served as an advocate of the High Court and the Court of Appeal of Tanzania since 1977. He's the former and indeed the first Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Research Chair in Pan-African Studies at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. His books are extensive. They include Class Struggles in Tanzania in 1976, Pan-Africanism or Pragmatism, Lessons of Tanganyika-Zanzibar Union in 2008, and The Accumulation of an African Periphery, a Theoretical Framework, which was published in 2009. We've invited Professor Issa Shivji to speak to us and share with us his critical perspectives on Pan-African thought. I will introduce our second speaker before he speaks. So I pass the microphone to Professor Issa Shivji. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Firoz. And thank you all who have organized this series. And I really thank you for giving me an opportunity to participate in this series. And I'm going to say something about the critical elements in the Pan-African thought. African Americans and African Caribbeans could only have logical and African view of the continent because when they were snatched away from the continent, there were no colonized countries with their borders which are drawn up by the imperialist countries. So their view of Africa was essentially continental and African. So they are the ones who were the founders of the Pan-African ideology and Pan-African movement. In the beginning, it was essentially an ideology which was anti-racist, a racial ideology, whose demand was for equal treatment and rights, non-discrimination, etc. And the evolution of the debates witnessed debates like between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. As you would know, Marcus Garvey advocated Back to Africa movement, while Du Bois advocated equal treatment in the US itself to be treated as equal citizens. But the turning point in the development of Pan-Africanist ideology was 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945 held in Manchester. Now, for the first time at this Congress in Manchester, you had a significant presence of Africans from the continent, because before the 5th Congress, the 4th Congress of Pan-Africanism had a great and more significant presence of African Americans and African Caribbeans. That is to say, people from diaspora. But 5th Congress had a very significant presence from the continent. Among them were Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. In fact, they were the joint secretaries of this Congress. And if you read the resolutions passed at this Congress, with hindsight, actually they were very progressive for its time. The demand was essentially a political demand. A demand was anti-imperialism, basically saying Africa is for Africans and that there should be given independence and national liberation. The demand was for African unity and social democratic rights. From this Congress, Nkrumah went back to fight for the independence of his country in Ghana with two clear goals. One was liberation from colonialism of the whole of Africa, because by then the whole of Africa was not liberated, and two was united Africa. In 1957, Ghana became independent, and Nkrumah immediately, and really immediately, set into motion two processes. One, the Conference of Independent African States. At this time, there are about 6 to 7 independent African states. And second was All Africa People's Conferences. The first All Africa People's Conference was held in 1958, and this was a momentous event. It was put together by George Padmore, very famous Pan-Africanist and African Caribbean. Leadership, to this conference, liberation movements were invited, leaders were, trade unions were there were a few heads of state, but there were very many prominent African individuals in one or another involved in liberation struggles. Frantz Fanon was there from Algeria. Patrice Lumumba from the Congo was there. Tom Mboya from Kenya was also there. At the time, he was a very young man. Kayama Chiume from Malawi was there. Abdul Rahman Mohamed Babu from Zanzibar were also there. So this was a very important conference of the African people. Anyway, these two sets of initiatives taken by Nkrumah, that is to say, Conference of African States and a Conference of African People, set into motion, and this I'm saying it with the wisdom of hindsight, two tendencies in the Pan-African thought: a state-centered tendency and a people-centered tendency. And the statist tendency culminated in the founding of the OAU in Addis Ababa in 1963, by which time most African countries had become independent. And the OAU drew up a compromise charter against Nkrumah's wish, because Nkrumah's demand was that African states, or even those who are just willing, should immediately form the United States of Africa. However, there were others, like Nyerere, who argued for a gradual process, that you cannot immediately form United Africa, but rather you should start building the African unity from blocks to blocks, gradually, step by step. This contestation between gradualism and radicalism has informed the Pan-African debates in the post-colonial period, almost throughout, both particularly in the discourse of OAU. Some of you may remember that there was a very famous exchange, a very heated exchange actually, between Nkrumah and Nyerere at Cairo Conference in 1964. Nyerere arguing for a step-by-step approach to African unity, while Nkrumah arguing for an immediate formation of United States of Africa. Anyway, as African states become independent, they consolidated the territorial nationalism. And once they became sovereign states with their leadership, they were reluctant to give up their sovereignty to form African unity. So the goal of African unity increasingly receded to the background. Even regional unity, which was advocated by Nyerere, like East African Federation, did not materialize. It was very interesting. The arguments that Nkrumah made for immediate formation of United States of Africa were essentially political arguments, because his argument was that if we do not do it now, then these states will become independent, imperialism will intervene, it will make these states very difficult for these states to unite, and therefore now was the time to form African states. Nyerere made a similar argument for East African Federation immediately. In fact, Nyerere was prepared to delay the independence of Tanganyika. So the 3 East African countries, no, the 4 East African countries, that is to say Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar, should together move into East African Federation, making almost the same arguments that Nkrumah was making for African unity. Anyway, it did not happen. Neither East African Federation nor United States of Africa. Then, as we know, Nkrumah was overthrown with the help of CIA in 1966. In 1997, Nyerere, on the 40th anniversary of Ghana's independence, said that the first generation of African nationalists had set themselves 2 goals, liberation and unity. In liberation, they had more or less succeeded, but they had failed to unite Africa. And in between the lines, Nyerere in that speech admitted that Nkrumah's arguments were actually strong. Okay? And what Nkrumah had predicted came to pass. That is to say, once these countries consolidated themselves as mini states, they became a kind of pawn in imperialist rivalry, in Cold War rivalry, and therefore they could not unite. These 2 tendencies that I talked about, the state-centric tendency and the people-centric tendency. The people-centric tendency, which originated with the African People's Conference in 1958, actually almost, not only it was put on the back burner, but it almost disappeared. What came to dominate the Pan-African discourse was a state-centric tendency. And the clash between these 2 tendencies came to a head in the organizing of 1974 6th Pan-African Congress, which took place in Dar es Salaam in 1974. The dispute between the 2 tendencies was essentially that whereas Tanzania wanted to invite African states, the radicals, among whom the prominent spokespeople were C.L.R. James and Walter Rodney, wanted all opposition groups and liberation movements to be invited in the image of the 1958 conference. Eventually, as you would expect, the dispute was resolved in favor of the statist position, led by Rodney. C.L.R. James and others from the diaspora pulled out from the 6th Pan-African Congress. And all the accounts of the Pan-African Congress which took place in Dar es Salaam show that it was essentially a state jamboree. It was a jamboree of the state, not the Pan-African Congress in the spirit of 1958 Congress of All Africa People's Congress. And very interestingly, in the paper circulated by Rodney ahead of the conference, argued for 2 positions that the Pan-Africanism should take. One, consistent anti-imperialism, and secondly, he argued, and built into this argument was his class position. He argued that the Pan-Africanism, and I quote, of the petty bourgeois states became a sterile formulation, incapable of challenging capitalism and imperialism. In this, Rodney was characterizing the independent African states, and he clearly put forward the position that these states were incapable of leading the African people into real, genuine Pan-Africanism. The Pan-Africanist discourse is co-opted by what Rodney called petty bourgeois African states was around the following contradictions or dilemmas. Now, this is in the statist discourse. One, territorial nationalism versus Pan-Africanism. And leading Pan-Africanists like Nyerere felt that as the independent states consolidated themselves and as they became more and more narrow nationalists, they were moving away from the goal of Pan-Africanism. Ideologies of developmentalism and survival in the Cold War flourished. Many of them became the ward of imperialism which used divide and rule between these countries. So increasingly, African unity became more and more difficult, both for internal as well as external reasons. And what came to the fore was some kind of a national project adopting different types of ideologies. When the neoliberal attack came in the 1980s, these countries could not withstand. They could not withstand the onslaught of neoliberalism, a new kind of imperialism, basically, which was really meant to rehabilitate imperialism. Because during the nationalist period, imperialism was on the defensive. And the neoliberalism attack and the surrender by African state, the neoliberalist dictate exposed the limits of the national project. In fact, I would say that the national project was defeated. And that dilemma, that contradiction between nationalism on the one hand, territorial nationalism on the one hand, and Pan-Africanism continues with us. It is with us to this day. The second set of debate was on economic integration versus political unity. Blocks of countries, neighboring countries, argued to start with economic integration, and then came political unity. So, for example, attempts were made in East Africa, and they are continuing to start with forming a common market. Then the idea was to form a monetary union, and so on, and then political unity. To this day, this program has not taken off because of the various contradictions and conflict of interests and competition between these states. Once again, it reminds us of Nkrumah's famous argument about seek the political kingdom first. Because of extreme uneven development, because of petty competitions between these African states, because of the consciousness of the ruling classes of their sovereignty, it becomes very difficult to take economic integration to its fullest development and then go to political unity. If you want to resolve some of the problems of economic integration, actually you have to have political unity first. Political unity has to precede economic integration so that it can then resolve some of the contradictions that economic integration puts forward. In West Africa, for example, ECOWAS similarly has issues. It has not been able to get united against imperialism. As we know, the various crises, the crisis in Ivory Coast, which was between indigenous people and foreigners, okay, which actually discriminates against fellow Africans. The xenophobia in South Africa, again, discrimination among Africans themselves, clearly away from all the vision of Pan-Africanist Africa. Now, these issues, in my view, cannot be addressed or resolved without a political unity, because they are essentially political questions, not economic questions. And even if the arise from economic inequalities and economic problems, they can only be addressed politically. The third argument was regional versus continental unity. And in this, there is a famous debate, an exchange of letters between Nkrumah and Nyerere. Nyerere argued for regional unity to start with, which would then form the building blocks of African unity. Now, this was logical argument. While Nkrumah argued that, in fact, what Nyerere was advocating was balkanization of Africa on the continental level. That, in fact, if these regional blocks will make African unity more difficult, rather than facilitate African unity. And history has proved him right, actually. Anyway, in the event, as I've said, and I repeat, the East African Federation did not come to fruition so far, nor have the African countries united, although the debate continues. And even the few countries which did attempt to unite, like Mali, Ghana, and Guinea Federation, did not last, nor did the Senegal-Gambia Union last. The only one which has lasted and still exists is that with Zanzibar and Tanganyika, Tanzania. It has survived, but it too has problems. Instead, what we are seeing in Africa are secessionist movements and disintegration of countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, which is on the verge of collapse. And in all these cases, imperialism has had a hand in keeping Africa disunited, and in fact, even instigating disintegration of African countries, the way they are involved now in Ethiopia and the way they were involved in Sudan, with the South Sudan seceding from Sudan. The fourth debate was between who is an African, and this has essentially happened among some of the intellectual Pan-Africanists. First, the question of diaspora, and I think this is more or less accepted, that no doubt diaspora are Africans and they should be acknowledged as Africans, but the issue of what would be their political role in the on the political landscape of Africa still remains an issue. It has not been resolved. As we all know now, diaspora is the sixth region of the OAU. The issue of North African Arabs has proved to be more elusive and actually more fractious. The argument that Arabs are not Africans, for example, they belong to the Arab League, and therefore the loyalties are divided at best, or the loyalties are not to Africa. In the earlier period, and people forget, particularly the pre-colonial period, there was a unity in the anti-imperialist struggle for liberation between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. But with the neoliberal agenda, imperialist neoliberal agenda, including militarization, this has become more and more and more difficult, as we are seeing in the disintegration of Libya and where the way Africans are treated there. Then there is also, of course, the question of the minorities as well in Africa, whether they're Africans or not. Nyerere once defined an African as someone who has made Africa his or her home and participates in the struggle. Therefore, Africans should not be recognized in terms of the pigment of the skin, but rather in terms of his or her loyalty and his or her full loyalty and participation in the struggles of African people. And this was clearly borne out by the struggle for independence, where people united, regardless of their origins, to fight for independence. But we know that bourgeois elites who came to power tried to divide people on ethnic and racial grounds by politicizing diversities into divisions. And this has made unity of all the people even more difficult. And therefore, I would say that we really need strong ideologies from the standpoint of the working people, which can unite the people in struggle regardless of their origins. I'll say more towards the end about this. There have been particular intellectual circles, intellectual debates to revisit Pan-Africanism, to refurbish it. However, these have been on and off. They have not been sustained. Particularly in the Codessia forum, we have had these debates. We had these debates in other forums as well. But as I said, they have not really been sustained, and they have been kind of diverted and sometimes detracted on other issues. But in my view, we need Pan-Africanism today more than ever before. We need to reconstitute Pan-Africanist ideology. We need to refurbish it in our present context. And I would argue there are certain points of departure for this. One is historically, we must recognize that Pan-Africanism is what gave birth to African nationalism and not the other way around. This is very different from other continents. It's Pan-Africanism which gave birth to nationalism, territorial nationalism, not the other way around. In fact, the first generation of African nationalists are all Pan-Africans, and this includes people like Hastings Banda, of course, Albert Luthuli. They're all Pan-Africans. And so are people like Tom Mboya. In fact, Nyerere once said that African nationalism outside Pan-Africanism is tribalism on an international scale. He argued that African mini-states cannot survive on their own and would not be able to withstand imperialist domination, or what he called second scramble for Africa. And we have seen it. He has been proved right. Particularly, he's been proven right in most of the recent developments that are taking place on the continent. The national project has clearly failed. And if any attempt is made to revive the national project, it actually degenerates into narrow nationalism. The other point I want to make is the national project was led by some or the other kind of bourgeois and petty bourgeoisie. And they were quickly compromised and compromised by imperialism. And they became linked to imperialism. And therefore, they could not continue to struggle, but Pan-Africanist struggle, which was essentially anti-imperialist struggle. In fact, neoliberalism has shown that even state sovereignty of African states has been compromised. Today, African states are sovereign only in a modicum sense, only in name. Thirdly, of course, it is true that Africa still needs development to liberate its people from the scourge of poverty. But the neoliberal type of development imposed by globalization is an illusion. It can neither be sustained, nor can it be all-inclusive. Instead, it reproduces and is reproducing the plunder and pillage of African resources while marginalizing the masses. Increasingly, I think the new Cold War, what some people have called new Cold War, is shifting to Africa, particularly because various foreign powers have their eye on the resources of Africa. So they continue to fight some of the proxy wars for the resources of Africa on the continent. Maybe what has happened in Europe recently on the Ukraine question might shift the stage. But otherwise, you can see that Africa is potentially the ground for battles between various imperialist powers. Now, in my concluding remarks, let me try to conclude this on the issue of reconstituting Pan-Africanism. I don't think we can give any a priori answers. Only real-life struggles of the people can throw up new forms and organization of struggles. But one thing that I have found in Africa, unlike many other continents, the Pan-Africanist sentiment, the Pan-Africanist emotion still remains strong. And this is true not of the old guard, but also the young people. Pan-Africanism strikes a chord in them. So we have the potential from where to begin. And I would suggest that there are some critical elements that could set the parameters of new Pan-Africanism. Let me very quickly summarize this. One, I would argue that Pan-Africanism clearly, unambiguously, and consistently has to be anti-imperialist. I don't go along with those who argue that there's no imperialism today. There is imperialism, and we may even get new forms of imperialism. Therefore, Africa has to continue fighting against imperialism. because it is under the hegemony of imperialism, the whole continent. Two, I feel that new Pan-Africanism must combine the task of national liberation and social emancipation, in which intersectional issues like gender, like generation, like race are built into. In other words, I am saying that we should move away from the immediate post-colonial argument of stages of development. That is national liberation first and then social emancipation. This was the argument, as you know, made in South Africa very strongly by the Communist Party and its allies. But one formulation by Amilcar Cabral always attracts me a lot, and I think it sums up in a very profound way what national liberation means. Cabral argued that independence under imperialism can only mean a national liberation movement in power. The argument being that the task of national liberation remains incomplete, unfinished with independence. So even after so-called independence, the struggle for national liberation continues. And I add to that that not only the struggle for national liberation continues, but that has to be combined with the struggle for social emancipation, not in some staged way. The third element is the very crucial element, critical element. Who would lead Pan-Africanism? What would be the leading class of Pan-African? In other words, who would be agency of Pan-Africanism? First point, general point that I argue is the working people of Africa will be the agency, not the states. So we must move away from this argument of the states leading us to into Pan-Africanism. That does not mean they cannot engage with the states, but you engage with the states in an organized form, always knowing that the state has limits. The bourgeois and petty bourgeois states have their limits, and they are not capable to be able to lead us to really consistent Pan-Africanism. Fourthly, I will argue that we need an all-round insurrection of Pan-Africanist ideas. And this is where intellectuals come in. It is intellectuals, the intelligentsia, who should spearhead an insurrection of Pan-Africanist ideas in various spheres: culture, art, politics, even science, education, and so on and so forth. We should start by forming people's unity and alliances between trade unions, between students' movements, between women's movements, between NGOs, led by Pan-Africanist ideology. In others, I'm saying, in Gramscian terms, that the battle for making a revolutionary Pan-Africanism hegemony has to be won at the level of African civil society before you move to the state. Finally, I cannot see how new Pan-Africanism can lead us to social emancipation if its vision is not grounded in a socialist vision. In other words, I am saying that the social question in new Pan-Africanism should not be, ought not to be subordinated to the national question in some stages theory. Both questions should be interlinked, integrated. Otherwise, once again, Pan-Africanism will degenerate into petty and narrow nationalisms, reactionary nationalisms, which actually we are seeing all over the continent. in things like xenophobia, in things like argument between indigeneity and foreigners, and so on and so forth. These narrow nationalisms will rear their ugly head if Pan-Africanism does not address the social question together with the national question. Thank you very much for listening to me. And once again, my apologies for the internet problems that we have had.
Thank you. So we now move to the second lecture today. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you Saleh Mamon, who's been a teacher and is a retired head teacher. He's an active campaigner for social justice, particularly against criminalization of asylum seekers, refugees, and other minority communities. His research interests in the history and contemporary life of the people and nations of the Global South. He currently writes articles on these issues and will share his website. He has been writing a number of very, very interesting analyses about popular resistance and the armed forces in Sudan. And those of you who've been watching some of the news will know about how a number of transnational corporations are supporting the military to undermine the gains of the recent popular uprisings in Sudan. So a very warm welcome to you, Saleh. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Warm greetings to everybody that's listening to us. And thank you to all the four organizers, I shall list them, that Nyerere mentioned, for organizing this wonderful series, which I find very informative. I've, in fact, watched some of them, and a lot of them have bearing on Sudan. And it's a delight to follow Issa Shivji. You know, he's very stimulating talk, and it will apply to Sudan at some point. I also want to say to the participants that I will have, but because I have a lot of information to pass, I'll make available the entire text of my talk and presentation to whoever needs it, and it should be available to Jade, and then she can facilitate making sure that people can get that. So can I now just move on to my presentation? Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about. As you can see, it's a very tightly focused talk, really, and there are advantages in that. And so I'm going to address the entire issue of popular resistance and the armed forces. But one of the central things I'm going to do is to put this question in its social context, in the historical context, in the political and economic context, and that's going to be the central point of my argument. I just for viewers, this is what Sudan is. It's a very large country. It's the third largest country in Africa. It was the largest country before South Sudan broke up. And as you can see, it's borders about 7 countries: Chad, Libya, Egypt, South Sudan. Very volatile area as well, and the Red Sea. So my next slide shows you the country itself. It's a very diverse country. The central feature, obviously, is the White Nile and the Blue Nile meeting together the Nile River. And you then have a vast plateau with the Nubian Desert and Libyan Desert, the mountains on the south and mountains west, and the Red Sea hills, and the Red Sea, quite a wide area, a major world trade route, really, of very strategic importance. This is the political map of Sudan, and you have 18 provinces, 18 states, they can call them. Central, the Khartoum is the center of Sudan, and if you look at the periphery, it's a vast periphery, really, when you look at it. and it's far away from Khartoum. And there's always tension between the periphery and the center, because center always allocates most resources to itself. And then you must have heard of Darfur in 2003, where there were allegations of genocide in a big way. But you wouldn't have heard many other provinces, neither had I before researching it. And I found that, you know, a lot of things are happening in all the cities across during this period as well. And so if you're following news, you have to keep up with that. I want to just select a point in history where we start from, and I'm going to start from the 1821 Turco-Egyptian rule. Turco-Egyptians invaded Sudan. They took it over, they unified it, they imposed very harsh taxes. And as a result of this harsh taxes, there was a rebellion in 1881. It was led by Muhammad Ahmed, who later went to become called Mahdi, the Guided One, who led the revolt. He led many successful military campaigns and captured Khartoum in 1885. The British journal Gordon was killed in Khartoum. He was known as Gordon of Khartoum. And Sudan then comes to the notice of the British Empire. The Mahdi became a legendary icon really in Sudan, and he is remembered today in Sudan. His legacy is still alive in the Ansar movement, his followers, who conquered the country as well. And today there's a National Umma party, which you know, it follows, you know, it's a kind of legacy of that particular movement as well. This is a Mahdi. It's visualized, right, on a horseback, as well as a fighter. He died in 1885, but his caliphate that he established went to conquer the whole of Sudan. This is the British visualization of the death of General Gordon. It's a portrait and a killing of Gordon, and became a cause célèbre within Britain. The British took their revenge in 1898 when they sent an expedition. General Christian invaded Sudan from the north, from Egypt. After fighting many battles, he came to the critical battle of Omdurman, north of Khartoum. Now, this critical battle, between 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. and that morning, 11,000 Sudanese were killed and 16,000 wounded. And these wounded were largely shot dead. The British loss was only 48 men. The Maxim gun was the weapon, the key to the British victory, and Sudanese with his rifles and swords had no answer to that. People have forgotten that this is one of the most brutal slaughters in the colonial world. And the Sudanese forces and the Sudanese society was traumatized. Sudan went to become a British colony in 1889 to 1956 to its independence. The Battle of Omdurman is celebrated by many, many paintings. This is just one of them. This is the Maxim gun battery, which did all the damage and killed so many Sudanese. I took this photo from a text called "Exterminate All the Brutes," and this actually shows the dark side of Sudan campaign, with the liquidation wounded, you know, and there was nothing by the British where did not show any kind of kindness to those who were wounded, to tend to them and to look after them. They just killed them. This is General Kitchener, and he was called Kitchener of Khartoum, and he went to become a very famous figure in British history. I want to talk about now Sudan after independence in 1956. The British government gradually in the 1950s went to a parliamentary system, introduced some kind of self-government. In the end, there was a parliament as well from 1953, and they voted for independence and never given independence. 1956, a republic was formed. It's lasted only 2 years, because in 1958, the chief commander-in-chief, Ibrahim Aboud, overthrew the parliamentary government in a coup. His regime lasted 6 years. In 1964, the October Revolution took place, where Aboud was overthrown. And the civil society movement, like Doctors' Union, the Bar Association, the Continental University Teachers Union, they led a general strike. And that brought Aboud down. In 1965, we had a series of Islamist governments. They were unable to govern. They were weak governments. They were unable to agree on any permanent constitution, because the Ummah party wanted an Islamic constitution. And there was problems with factionalism, economic stagnation, ethnic distance. So 4 years later, in 1969, Jafar Numeri in the army led another military coup. And that he ended the republic, and he started a one-party state. In 1995, there's a widespread, after 16 years, widespread revolt against Numeri. There was called the April Intifada uprising. He was deposed, and the Transitional Military Council took power. In 1986, the coalition government was formed, and Mohammed Sadiq al-Mahdi of the National Party was the prime minister. In 1989, again, after 4 years, the military again takes over. There's another military coup, and President Omar Bashir takes power, and he goes on to rule for 30 years. The critical event also was the secession of South Sudan in 2011, the breaking of Sudan, and Issa Shivji mentioned Sudan several times. We then look, I've just summarized this for you, the political history of Sudan in this particular flow chart. So if you look at the green boxes over here, they are the parliamentary governments, 3 times only, and they are not lasting very long. 3 years, in this case, 4 years here, and 4 years here, 11 years altogether. In between, we have coups. We have Aboud coup, Numeri coup, another 9 years for Aboud, Numeri 16, and al-Bashir coup for 30 years. If you look at that, there are 52 years when the army has ruled Sudan, and there are serious consequences for that. And you have General Aboud over here, just photos of them, Numeri, and Omar Bashir. And this is Sadiq al-Mahdi, who passed away. He was also the Imam of the Ansar, and he, in fact, was the great-grandson of the original Mahdi that I mentioned, the icon of Sudan. Now, I want to argue that over this time, Sudan has got a military power elite. And over decades, this power elite is politically and organized and centralized, very highly centralized and united. It's made itself a fundamental political institution, just as in Egypt. Most of all, it's captured the state and its institutions. And any government that is there, the military supervises that government. It's keystone of this system. And there's a compact between business classes, landowners, bureaucrats, middlemen, you can speak of industrialists, that allows the military to control. The whole system is based on clientelism, patronage, favoritism, and a lot of corruption to go with it. I'll come to the next point later. I want to talk about if military took power, where did the politics fail? So I think I want to talk about the failures of the political parties. The first failure of the political party of them was to fail to develop a political culture which embeds democracy. The second was they always formed weak governments, and there was lack of unity among them. The third root is an immense tension between Islamist parties who wanted to emphasize on the Arab Muslim identity and continue to do so today, and the secular modern forces, including the Communist Party. The Islamist parties moved to Sudan towards becoming Islamic State, wanting the Sharia law to be effective. Now, the different blocs in the parties supported military takeovers actively as a lever against others. Within the military, there were also Islamic tendencies. So one of the most important things was politicians failed to confine the military in the barracks. That was central. That was their great failure. The military leaders also enacted Islamic laws to please the parties and also influence the population. I'm quite sure that, and I'm no doubt this alienated the Christian South. Obviously, there are many other reasons, and they seceded from South to South Sudan in 2011. One thing I want to point out, interesting fact of history with Osama bin Laden, who was an ally of America at the beginning of the Afghan war, later to become an enemy, and was in Sudan from 1991 to 1996. And because of this, because of some bombings in Africa as well, in 1993, the United States listed Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism. And that was one of the key things that would affect Sudan in future. Now, I want to turn to about this military. Not only does it have political, economic, kind of technical power and the military power, but it is a large commercial empire. The crown jewel on that is the defense industrial system. It manufactures a lot of armaments. I've listed some: handguns, machine guns, battle tanks, howitzers, recently drone production. Besides this, it's got 200 holding commercial companies. And one of the most important things that they've turned to the sale of gold, mining and sale of gold, and there are other minerals. Then marble, leather, cattle, and gum arabic as well. So the control of import trade is a very important part of this commercial enterprises, and 60% of the wheat market, for example, is controlled by companies linked to the military. Holding companies, they have holding companies in all sectors: telecommunication, banking, water distribution, contracting, construction, real estate development, aviation, transport, tourism facilities. They're also involved in manufacture of household appliances, piping, pharmaceuticals, detergents, and textiles. Now, this critical organization called RFS, called Rapid Support Forces, is now a part of the military. It's got 250 companies, holding companies. It's kept a large part of the country's gold industry. And it's also involved in fighting in Yemen and hiring out troops there to help the Libyans, to help UAEs and Saudis. It's also in Libya. And one important thing is that they also do not pay any tax. So that's quite important. The last context thing is that in this particular recent crisis is the history of perpetual economic crisis in Sudan. Post-independence, we see very low growth, depending on cotton exports. But the 1973 oil shock shook Sudan, because it left it deeply indebted. They had to get dollars and get loans to buy the oil. So 1978, the IMF imposed structural adjustment, austerity, which you have heard about it, watched a terrible effect of that on African countries. In 1984, again, Sudan had a severe crisis, drought, inflation, capital flight, reduce aid and exchange, foreign exchange. In 1988 onwards, Sudan, went to neoliberal policies for privatization of its assets, and a lot of assets were handed over to Bashir's cronies. In 1997, US imposed sanctions, and that affects investment and growth. 1997 onwards, the IMF again imposes reforms, austerity reform. Now, crucially, 2002, 2012 were the golden years for Sudan. There was an oil boom because oil had discovered a few years ago, and oil started flowing, and that increased prosperity tremendously. A lot of people benefited. It also gave money, to grease palms for their own cronies, and supports of the patronage. In 2012, South Sudan secedes. So Sudan loses 70% of its revenues. It almost goes bankrupt. It begins to sell land to Arab countries and displaces indigenous communities as well in doing so. In 2013, there's an uprising, a very large uprising, because the fuel prices had doubled, and this uprising was suppressed violently, and estimate 100 deaths. Now, this particular uprising was a rehearsal of what was going to happen on 2018 for the new democratic revolution. Sudan is a debt bondage of about 60 billion, public debt to 2002%, and GDP for 2012. The poverty in Sudan stands at 46%. There is serious hunger in the country, high proportion of children undernourished. And Sudan has the lowest human development based on the life expectancy, education, and per capita income. So I think that context is very important. I now that come around to the current events in the last, in 2018. In 2018, late 2018, the austerity really was biting. There were long queues for bread and fuel, and prices were high. Budget cuts after budget cut followed, and the country's social safety nets were discarded. The key commodity subsidies, very fundamental to these countries, of bread and fuel, were removed, and the military spending remained very high. By December 2018, bread prices had tripled. Young protesters came out in the streets, most of them school-stage students, and spontaneously took to streets. Such protests were quickly snuffed out by heavily deployed security forces. But 19th December becomes a key date in Sudan's history, because the students at Para Industrial School, at Para is a city northeast of Khartoum, and a center of industry and rail. The grievance they had was a tamia sandwich had become unaffordable. Now, what is tamia sandwich? Now, tamia is the most common breakfast consumed by impoverished Sudanese. So demonstrations began. They began by burning barricades and streets. The students marched all the way at the headquarters of the ruling party called National Congress Party, and they torched and burnt it to ground. Now, what happens? This is an artist's visualization of the Atbara Metzig, imaginative, torching the NCP headquarters. The uprising spreads now nationwide. It goes nationwide now. The image of the gutted offices and Atbara spread like wildfire. They go viral with social media. The public anger increases over the cost of living. And after 30 years of al-Bashir's rule, there were many grievances. Spontaneous protests broke out everywhere, night and day, and days and weeks. Khartoum, Omdurman, the center, and other cities saw protests daily. Security forces responded with normal tear gas, rubber-coated steel bullets, and even live fire. Hundreds of protesters were arrested and released on the same day because prisons were full. To shame the protesters, the police shaved their heads, and the killing of protesters, led to angry funerals. So al-Bashir then declared state of emergency for a year. He dissolved the federal government and the state governments. He appointed military officers and as new governors. He dissolved the Council of Ministers. He assigned the secretaries, general ministries to run the ministries. He set up new government of competence. The protesters took the streets then. And then as well. So they came out. They were protesting in the city of Omdurman everywhere, and never met with the normal tear gas and by the police. The president claimed the demonstrations were an attempt to destabilize the country. There were now 1,000 people had been arrested since it started, and 40 were killed in the protests. 40 were killed by the security forces. Something critical happened then, and that important date is the 6th of April. And here, 6th April marks the anniversary of the 1985 uprising that overthrew Nyerere. Protesters decided they would march to the headquarters of the military in Khartoum. And from past experience, they knew that the army would not allow them to reach the headquarters. So they had deceived the army. They advertised time and places of rallies away from the center to draw the security forces. Secretly, group of protesters also got together when the police did not, where the police did not expect them to be. So these protesters, when they began to advance the military headquarters, the military was too spread out. And this maneuver, they occupied the square. Central issue, very important thing happened on that day. That became a moment's rallying point. And people came in, more and more people, more demonstrators poured in. They brought in water, food supplies, and into the demonstration. The sit-in began. And the Sudan Professional Association, which have, civil society, which had a history of leading revolutions well, stood up and made an announcement that the sit-in would not move until Bashir was gone. The protesters demanded al-Bashir's resignation with chants called Taskut Bas, just fall, just fall. They wanted Bashir to go. This is where the Nile, this is where protesters were, this is the armed forces complex as well. This is the president offices away from that. And just a photo to show that the large gathering of different kinds of Sudanese. Must emphasize here that women have been involved in the Sudanese revolution on the streets, both as intellectuals, both as analysts and writers, etc. Just a photo to share another picture of young men outside the military headquarters. Now, al-Bashir responded to this to sit-in, and that response split the army. And I'll come to that and explain to how it happened. He ordered the sit-in to be cleared. And the next day, the security forces showed up and fired at the crowd. The protesters lay flat on the ground to avoid bullets. The critical thing was some of the army units on the site became protective of the protesters. They were very sympathetic with the protesters. There were several attacks by the police forces the next 2 days. and they were all repelled by rank and file soldiers. And that was very, very important. Angry, Bashir called the militias at his disposal to attack the sit-in on 8th of April. The militias, supported by the police and intelligence services, then snipers as well, attacked the protesters. But the pact between the rank and file military and protesters means that they could not be cleared. So the protesters now built barricades and then protestides, and they're brought in and have food supplies, emergency healthcare on site. This is an example of the clinical setup by them. We now go to the military response to remove Bashir. By 11th April, Bashir, there's a power struggle within the military. 11th April, the military decides to remove this, Security Committee decides to remove Bashir. And the Vice President announced on national TV, there's a transitional military council formed, there's a power struggle within the military, and Vice President loses out, Bashir's intelligence loses out, and they appointed General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan to lead the military council, and Mohammed bin Daglo, this important person, called Hemeti as a deputy. Hemeti is the most feared person, actor in Sudan. He became famous in Darfur for organizing Janjaweed militia, which allegedly killed 300,000 in Darfur. That's a figure. And his rapid support force now has been integrated in the army. These are the two people, most powerful people in Sudan today, al-Burhan and Daglo. The military council has a tactic, they negotiate and prepare for attack. So they started negotiating with the forces of freedom and change. And this is an umbrella organization of 22 civil society organizations. There were rumors of breakthrough, etc. in that, and the TMC spoke of making concessions to civilians. They wanted to remain dominant in the party. At the same time, the TMC became very bullish and said they will not accept chaos. The protesters were on edge because they were not sure what's going to happen. On 13th May, the sit-in was attacked in late night. They suddenly heard sounded gunfire. The RSF forces began firing on the crowd with machine guns mounted on their trucks. As that the gunfire rattled through the night, the protesters formed human corridors to lead health clinics. The dead and injured were carried on stretchers, made fencing, ripped from the ground. To stop the RF advancing, they dug bricks up, they built new taller barricades, and by the morning they'd expanded the protest area. They really extended the protest area to the presidential palace. The RSF stepped back, and the SPA then called, and the FFC called for them to go back to the sit-in. Now, this is a critical date for Sudan. The RSF attacked the sit-in violently. At 5 a.m., they cut off electric power, and internet. At 5 a.m., they stormed the sit-in. 200 military tracks were involved. 1,000 soldiers were involved. The heavy gunfire, tear gas, and sound bombs were used. Unarmed protesters were gunned down. Untold number of bodies were thrown in Nile. Nobody knows how many people were thrown in Nile. Other protesters were beaten. Protesters were beaten, abused, and humiliated. Tents were burned. Property was looted. Within a few hours, there was nothing left of the sit-in. The RSF spread throughout Khartoum, forcing protesters into homes, dismantling barricades, pulling people out of vehicles. And there was a widespread fear in Khartoum for coming days. These are 3 young men, were idealists who were at that protesters died, and just to show you the photo of them. So Let me take it to the human cost of the 3rd June massacre. The military said official deaths of 87. The credible estimates 120 killed, 12 were children. 900 were injured. There were bodies pulled from River Nile. Dozens were reported missing. Hundreds of unarmed citizens were arrested. 70 women were raped, according to doctors. Now, by mid-July, the casualties stood at 246 deaths, 1,350 injuries. This was unprecedented. Never happened before in Sudan under Sudanese uprising. And Sudanese masses remember this, what was done to them. They commemorate this tragedy every year. And in fact, last Friday, Sudanese were out demonstrating. Another thing, then, the civil society organizations started again. The protests started again. There were neighborhood protests, activities. They built barricades to frustrate the security forces. The FFC called for civil obedience and a general strike on the 30th of June. There was a march, called for a march of millions across Sudan on the 30th of June. So the process followed. Again, the military council uses violence, but the military is now on the defensive. It had no answer because general strike. So they started negotiation with the FFC, and they resumed and they made some sort of progress. The FFC declared end to the civil obedience, and there was a transitional agreement signed on the 17th of July. And that's a very important agreement. Now, these are elements of the transition agreement. There's the creation of the 11-member Sovereignty Council, 5 military members, 5 civilian, and plus 1 extra civilian. Key thing, it will have 39 months for transition. The first 21 months will be chaired by the TMC member. A civilian chair will take over 18 months. It's very critical transition. And they agreed to create a constitutional document, and the Council of Ministers will be appointed by the FFC. Now, I think the Constitutional Charter was quite a significant document. There are 17 legal articles, 16 chapters. There is the kind of liberal thing of respect for human dignity and diversity, justice and equality, guarantee of human rights and freedoms, primacy of rule of law, and there are all kind of definition of, roles and powers, rules, declaration of quality interest. But one thing they said, they'll establish a transitional legislative assembly with a gender balance, and they will also, get national judicial bodies for reparative justice for the crimes committed, and the power to establish independent commissions, including the Electoral Commission. Most important, they also agreed to establish a Bill of Rights and Freedoms, and then to deal comprehensively with peace and conflict issues, because Sudan has a lot of issues in terms of conflicts with at the periphery. And I must say that this particular document was signed with the president of South Sudan and Ethiopia witnessing, and also the European Commission representatives were there. So it's quite an important document. We see in a transitional government set up in September 2019, Abdul Hamdok was appointed as the PM, and there was a civilian cabinet, and his cabinet inherited an economic crisis. So Hamdok went to UN General Assembly. He's pleaded for the removal of US list for sponsor of terrorism. In December 2020, Trump removed that. In return, Sudan had to normalize relationships with Israel. That was bargain. US enabled $50 billion in debt relief and $2.4 billion funding in June 2021 with via IMF and World Bank. But the condition was that there will be economic austerity reforms agreed by the IMF. So we had cuts. We had cutbacks in the subsidies. Again, we have the repetition of the same again by the government. Inflation crept up to 400%, making many things unaffordable for the poor Sudanese. There was increasing hardship in living conditions of many Sudanese. And Hamdok said that the civilian government only had 18% of the state's resources in their hands, which meant that the other resources were controlled by the military, because the military always appropriated 70% of Sudan's budget. This is Abdullah Hamdok, the Prime Minister of the transitional government. Now, one important thing they did, besides others, was that at the end of 2019, they set up an empowerment removal committee. The idea was to recover funds from al-Bashir's cronies who had made financial gains through patronage. The other interesting was the US were very active in Sudan. And in 1st January, the UN had passed an act called this act called Sudan Democratic Transition Accountability and Fiscal Transparency Act. It's a bit of a mouthful. It requires Sudanese government to stop civilian control over military finances and assets. So in March 21, there's an agreement reached between the military and the journalists for gradual divestment. But there were two stumbling blocks to this. Because of full financial disclosure, there had to be all assets declared and civilian capacities to take over. The generals refused to cooperate. And the ERP, nonetheless, in April 2020, they recovered 20 million square meters of residential land and more than 1 million acres of agricultural land and dozens of businesses. But this is minuscule when you look at the assets that the military had. But this example did rattle those in the military who had vast commercial empire. The military then begins to exploit the weaknesses in the power sharing agreement. First of all, Al-Burhan acts as de facto head of state, representing Sudan. Secondly, his deputy heads the civilian government's economic committee controlling economic policy. Thirdly, Hamiti also becomes a chief peace negotiator with rebel factions. They are also active in foreign policymaking. I'll come to that later because they have relationship with Egypt, later with Israel, a new relationship with Israel, but also with Saudi Arabia, a major long-term relationship, and also with UAE. They were active, involved in foreign wars and with PACs. Then there was diplomatic relations with Israel, and the civilian cabinet was not involved. The intelligence services, meanwhile, were very active. They were surveilling the oppositions. The security services were still suppressing protests. The militias were active on the periphery to control the population. And the military power elite maintained a grip of the economy. The military started ratcheting up tensions now. That's about tensions. So you begin to July 21 when Al-Burhan was about to hand over the chairmanship to the civilian councils. The military power went on the offensive, and they mobilized the Beja tribe in eastern Sudan to blockade the main highway to Port Sudan. Severe bread shortages followed, fuel, medicine. The government asked the military to dismantle the blockade. They refused to do so. And 21st September, TMC announced that there was a coup attempt. But that was a trial balloon, really. They were trying it out. On 16th October, several thousand anti-government protesters were bussed in to the gates of the palace. They openly called for military takeover and overthrow the Hamdok administration. Pro-democracy protesters also organized. Yeah, this is another critical thing that's for us. They happen. They have coup happen on Monday, October 25th. Burhan dissolved the military power sharing council, declared a state of emergency, dismissed transitional government, regional governments. He actually nullified the constitutional charter. He had no respect for that. Arrested the prime minister, detained the ministers, detained political leaders, and he justified the coup saying he wanted to avoid a civil war and promised that all elections in 2023. And he also laughingly said this was not a coup. There was a massive resistance now across Sudan, which continues today. Massive resistance built up. Thousands of people came across Khartoum spontaneously. They demanded release of political leaders. They carried the national flag and burned ties across the city. The youth barricaded the streets. The soldiers restricted movement in Khartoum, clashed with them. A large number were arrested. 7 protesters were killed and 140 injured. The FFC then called for peaceful elections. 30 October saw around 4 million people came out in the streets in 30 cities. Workers struck across to shut down transport, oil fields, banking, and public bodies. Many women joined the street demonstrations. Teachers, university, school students walked out. Now, since then, millions of their marches have been taken across Sudan. The police fired tear gas canisters, directly at protesters, injuring them, blinding many. So this is a kind of summary: 98 dead since October 2015, 4,500 injured, some loss of 35 losing limbs and organs, 8 paralyzed. So it's quite serious, and there's incident of sexual violence as well. The civil society then got together and they began took a position. The position was they wanted no negotiations, no partnership, no compromise with the military. They wanted the military to be overthrown, coup to be overthrown. They wanted them, they wanted to put them in immediate trial. There were no, as I said, no dialogue with them. They wanted to dissolve all militias as well. They want to remove all armed forces and the police forces from political process, which I repeated it, and they wanted to form new structure of transitional authority as well for a specific period of time for relevant professionals and academic bodies, and they want complete sovereignty of the civilians on political and security and economic aspects of national life. This is just talking about Sudan Professional Association, a very old association, and they in fact had 17 different Sudanese trade unions. They were set up in 2012. 2016, they formal alliance with doctors, journalists, and lawyers. They were involved in the 2000 Atbara protests. They were then involved in Khartoum massacre, etc., during that particular period. I will now come to very quickly to the resistance committees. This is a unique, novel phenomena in Sudan and in Africa today. They emerged in Khartoum's impoverished working-class neighborhoods. Because the popular anger against Bashir's regime's state violence. They're unique. They're not the committees that we imagine. They assemble in open spaces, squares, in yards, in homes. They have open access. And they're ad hoc, like neighborhood football teams, waged, unwaged, salaried informal workers, peddlers, and artisans, school students, university graduates, school dropouts, all can join it. They team to organize the neighborhood protest marches in Latin America. And I say they do more than that. They provide services, they collect rubbish when necessary. During COVID, they're helping people as well. They provide drugs for people who are ill, etc. The decisions they make are made collectively, horizontally, and not in a hierarchical manner. And they have committees, can form bigger regional coordinate committees and state committees. I think this is very important for me because you can see they're organized across the country, and we have a total of 5,289 committees I think this is a messy, messy number. It's quite unique, really, a unique resistance. And therefore, they are targeted by the military. They're targeting them. Surveillance, intimidation, house raids, kidnapping, enforced disappearances, illegally arbitrary detention, and torture. There are 1,600 activists who are now under arrest. And al-Burhan then started sabotaging civilian rule, dividing the opposition. He wanted a technocratic government. He on 11th November, he set up a new sovereignty council. Obviously, he would remain as the chair and deputy. He is the deputy as Hemeti. He had self-selected members of the military and civilians included. Ex-labor leaders came in as well. But crucial thing here, FFC was totally excluded, the civil society organization. And that left FFC divided about strategy, etc. And there was criticism of it as well. And another million march followed, a single youth project across the country. There was fatalities, etc. That continued. And rallying comments from Surukai was again, they wanted the military to go. They wanted the regime to fall. And just this is from 31st of March from Madani, a photo from Madani, people marching, and then marches like that happening everywhere in Sudan. I can miss that. Now I'm just capturing the instruments of repression, and you can see the state of emergency is one aspect of it. Excessive violence being used, and that's been documented. And these are the things being used: security service apparatus, prison system, courts, bureaucracy. And these are the vast security apparatus that they have, including the militias over that. So, that's being used against civilian populations. This is just a kind of, I was playing around with it, showing you, the kind of, what the non-violent resistance is: protests, marches, sit-ins, general strikes, occupation, roadblocks. You've heard about it, workplace strikes, etc. Now, what happens is that he makes a second attempt to have a technocratic government. He releases Hamdok on 21st November. He signs a 14-point agreement with Burhan, restores him as prime minister. The tactics to allay street protests, to influence public opinion, allay international criticism of the coup. It was rejected by the resistance committees, rejected by the SPA. And Thursday, 25 again, thousands of protesters came out on the streets, millions probably. 42 were killed. People want the downfall of the regime. That was the cry. And 2nd January, Hamdok resigned because he could not form a government. He failed to form a government. The resistance committees on 28th of February, they called, issued a People's Authority Charter. They wanted a new People's Authority formed, opposed to the coup, junta. They wanted to unite all the revolutionary forces who took part, and they wanted to exclude everyone who took part in October 21 coup. And the charter is being consulted on and open to amendments. But the key non-negotiable parts are civilian state, overthrow of military council, holding it accountable for fair trials, refusal for any negotiation with those involved in the coup. Their aim really is to stop the military ever taking power in Sudan.
Saleh, I'm going to ask you to summarize now, because
can I just simply say that recently it's 1603, so I will summarize it quickly. Sorry about that. Recently there have been indications they're trying to resuscitate the NCP, Bashir's old party, and they're trying to form a broad Islamic front, and maybe it'll go on to run in elections. I'm kind of quickly call it geopolitics. That's quite important, if you let me. Sudan's always a locus of competition of regional powers. There's pressure of realignment in regional politics. Patronage is very important here. Al-Bashir had links to the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by Qatar. But the UAE and after 2021, UAE comes in back. I call it Arab Troika. And that routes Sudan into the exile. Sudan also deploys 30,000 mercenaries to Yemen, for example. Qatar then cuts off military shipments, and that's Bashir's fault. US, by the way, is a key ally of Arab Troika, and US plays a great role, an important role, and US still has removed sanctions and imposed sanctions, but it is a major diplomatic player at the moment. And what's the question is, what are its intentions? The US has never supported democratic rule as such. Only managed democracy. We're not a revolutionary government, and it carried out many coups historically. There is a UN intervention. There is a mission called UNITAMS, and they're consulting people. They've issued a summary paper. They consult 800 people, 810 meetings, summary paper, but it's leading to nothing. And the resistance forces are not cooperating with them. I want to say here that the military council counter-revolution has failed, and all you can use is violence. The popular resistance has not been defeated. It has changed Sudan's history, and it brought down 30 years of people.
I'm sorry, Saleh, it's now 5 past 11 in Beijing.
Thank you. So I'll stop there. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just show you. I just said that we need international solidarity from everybody, from those who are listening across the world for release. Now, this is my last picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is cutting down the military tree.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Saleh. We have a number of questions. It's quite late in Beijing now, and we have, I understand, about 1,500 followers on Bilibili. So let me just summarize the key questions that have arisen.
Sure.
And that was how was the military economic elite related to the transnational corporations? What are the TNCs doing to dominate Sudanese resources? The second question is, how do Western states such as USA, Europe, Israel, and so on, and the Middle East states, Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, etc., react to the repression of the resistance committees? Is the situation in South Sudan any better? And could you say a little bit more about land struggles for food security? It seems that there are food crises and hunger in many areas. How do Sudanese people respond to this food problem? I'd like you to sort of give a quick overview of that in the light of the time that we have.
I think the TNC are involved in every possible way, and all kinds of agreements with them, but also that we have these financial transactions going through international banks, for example, because Sudan would be transacting with them. And for example, there are transactions going on in terms of gold, etc., and oil as well. Not much for Sudan, but all kinds of trade is going on, in mining, etc. And I think if you look at the relationship with Saudi Arabia, it's a very deep relationship with UAE as well, because all the gold that's mined there goes to UAE largely, and South Sudan obviously is going through a desperate period, really, after partition. I haven't really followed it up, but it's not in a very good situation. So the partition was actually damaging to both North Sudan and South Sudan, really. That particular it affected both countries. And partly because Sudan in the north, failed to develop a secular society as well. And there was Arab Islamic identity, Sharia law, etc. I haven't studied the land struggles. I'm quite sure they're going on in the periphery as well. The Sudan in Darfur is a land struggle, between settled communities and then between people who are kind of more nomadic people, and also it's also about clearing people of land, and also taking over those land for gold mining, etc. And there's also gun culture that came through because of Libya, etc., and kind of transit to Libya as well. So, people with gun rule in Darfur, for example. I'm trying to briefly cover it, and then it's a larger topic really as well. In the
Right.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, there was a question earlier on which was posed to Issa as well, and I think has relevance to what you've just been saying. And that how do we locate the struggles against extractivism, mining, oil companies, etc., in relation to the revived Pan-Africanism, the sort of anti-imperialist and socialist movements? Issa, do you want to respond to that particular question? Hello, Issa, are you still there?
Yes, I'm there. Thank you very much for this really detailed overview of Sudan. Lots of questions, but I guess we don't have time. I think the whole idea about Pan-Africanism that I was trying to put forward is both at ideological level to lead the struggles and at the level of movement to form movements. Okay. Now, what organizational form they will take will depend on very concrete situations. But if they're anti-imperialists, then obviously there will be anti-imperialists both in the political sense, but also in economic sense against extremism and so on. And I did mention towards the end of how Africa is becoming the battleground for Cold War rivalries now, based on resources. We are at the moment witnessing the arms struggle that is going on in Mozambique, all right? And of course, in West Africa, it is going on. So at the end of the day, whatever form they may take, at the end of the day, they are about the resources of Africa, and extractivism is actually blatant, taking place all over Africa. Many of the governments, even a government like Tanzania, which has some radical credentials, has now fallen in line and has opened up to multinationals and so on. And both agribusiness, mining companies, and oil companies, etc., etc. So it seems to me that the Pan-African struggle that I was talking about, for sure, it has to be a struggle against this economic exploitation and the role of the multinationals and TNCs. Thank you.
Okay, one final point to you, Saleh. I mean, to what extent have the oppositions organized around opposing the transnationals in Sudan?
Can I? Sorry, are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that in terms of extractivism, Sudan needs, people need to bring up links with Tunisia, etc., and many other countries where there are movements, and that kind of solidarity is absolutely vital against mining industries, against oil extraction, etc. So that those links are built together. I also want to kind of emphasize that we haven't talked about the fight for democracy, and that is central to the Sudanese struggle at the moment. They made it a cause. This is a democratic struggle within the country, and also in Africa. One thing we need to talk about also is the military blocking democracy. You look at Africa, we have coups after coups happening, and the military is actually blocking the pathway forward. I mean, for me, that's a very, very central issue. What do you do about military power across the world? You look around it and they are blocking it. And in Egypt, for example, they destroyed the Rai uprising in 2011. The counter-revolution was very, very familiar. So I think for me, that's a central question.
Well, it's coming up to 11:15 in Beijing, and our comrades and the translators have been working very hard
I know.
in keeping everything up to date. So I'd like to just express our thanks to you, Saleh, and to to you, Issa, for what I think is been a very, very interesting couple of sessions here. Let me pass the baton on to Jade.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Issa Shivji and also Mr. Salaam. And now we have over 1,600 followers on Bilibili. So thank you very much. Your very excellent presentation. And I would also announce that we will organize the 9th South-South Forum on Sustainability from 8th of July to 12th of August. And we will continue to facilitate the solidarity amongst the Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we really support Pan-Africanism, and also we support the Pan-Asianism or Pan-Latin Americanism. We continue to fight for humanity liberation. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you.
Okay.